The morning of July 15, 2002, started like any other for farmer Robert Chen in upstate New York. He drove his tractor through the cornfield, preparing for the harvest season. The metal detector At 8:47 a.m., the detector began screaming near the eastern edge of his property. Chen shut off the engine and climbed down. Buried 3 feet under the corn stalks, partially exposed by recent heavy rains, sat a rusted blue barrel. Chen called his neighbor Jake Morrison, who arrived with shovels and a crowbar. Together they pried open the corroded lid. The smell hit them immediately. Inside, wrapped in deteriorating plastic sheets, were human remains and a tattered NYPD uniform. Morrison grabbed Chen's cell phone and dialed 911. "We found a body in a barrel on the Chen farm. Route 47, mile marker 12. Looks like it's been here a long time. There's a police uniform." Within 30 minutes, the property swarmed with New York State Police, the County Sheriff's Department, and the medical examiner. Detective Sarah Martinez from the State Police took charge of the scene. "Mr. Chen, when did you buy this property?" Martinez asked, pulling out her notebook. 1989. Previous owner was some city guy, never farmed it. Left it sitting empty for years before selling to me," Chen replied, still shaken. Martinez examined the barrel more closely. The serial numbers were still partially visible. Inside the remains, she found a corroded badge and wallet. The badge read NYPD 4789, and the wallet contained the deteriorated remains of an ID card. "Detective Martinez, we got something," called Officer Williams from the evidence team. He held up a plastic evidence bag containing a tattered driver's license. Name appears to be Detective Michael Kozlowski. Address in Queens. Expiration date 1987. Martinez felt her pulse quicken. She'd heard older detectives mention the Kozlowski case during her training years. A decorated NYPD detective who'd simply vanished in 1985, leaving behind a wife and 2 young children. "Williams, get me everything on Detective Michael Kozlowski, NYPD. Disappeared around 1985. And I want to know who owned this property before Chen bought it." The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Valdez, approached Martinez. "Preliminary examination suggests the remains have been here for approximately 15-20 years. The barrel shows significant corrosion consistent with long-term burial. I'll need full autopsy results, but there appear to be trauma marks on the skull." Martinez walked the perimeter of the discovery site. The barrel had been buried in a remote corner of the property, far from the main road, and hidden by dense corn growth. Whoever put it here knew the area well and expected it to remain undisturbed. By noon, Martinez had established a timeline. Detective Michael Kozlowski disappeared on October 3, 1985, after leaving his precinct in Manhattan for what he told colleagues was a routine follow-up interview. His car was found 3 days later in a parking garage in Queens, wiped clean of fingerprints. The original investigation, led by Detective Captain James Sullivan, concluded that Kozlowski had likely been killed by organized crime figures he'd been investigating. However, no body was ever found, and the case went cold after 18 months. Martinez obtained the original case files from NYPD archives. Kozlowski had been investigating a series of construction site thefts in Manhattan, involving millions of dollars in stolen equipment and materials. His notes mentioned several suspects, including construction company owner Vincent Romano and City Inspector Harold Brennan. At 4 p.m., Martinez called Kozlowski's widow, now remarried as Elena Vasquez, living in New Jersey. "Mrs. Vasquez, this is Detective Martinez with New York State Police. We've found remains we believe belong to your late husband, Michael Kozlowski." The phone went silent for several seconds. "After all these years? Where?" "A farm in upstate New York. We'll need you to provide DNA samples for positive identification, but we found his badge and ID with the remains." Elena's voice trembled. "Detective, my children have grown up not knowing what happened to their father. They're adults now, with families of their own. If this is really Michael, we need to know who did this." Martinez assured her the investigation would be thorough. She arranged for Elena and the adult children, David and Maria Kozlowski, to provide DNA samples the following day. That evening, Martinez reviewed the original case files at the state police barracks. Kozlowski's investigation notes were meticulous. He'd identified a pattern of thefts from major construction sites, always occurring during shift changes or lunch breaks. The stolen equipment was never recovered, suggesting an organized network with the ability to quickly move and resell heavy machinery. The last entry in Kozlowski's notebook, dated October 2, 1985, read, "Meeting with informant tomorrow. Claims to have information about Romano's warehouse operation. Location, Pier 47, 3 p.m." Martinez cross-referenced the pier location with property records from 1985. Pier 47 had been owned by Romano Construction Company, the same company Kozlowski had been investigating. She pulled Vincent Romano's background file. Born 1943, Romano had built his construction company from a small family operation into one of Manhattan's major contractors by 1985. He'd secured numerous city contracts, despite complaints about cost overruns and delays. The file also mentioned Romano's business partner and city liaison, Inspector Harold Brennan from the Department of Buildings. Brennan had been responsible for approving Romano's projects and conducting safety inspections. Martinez made a note to interview both men, assuming they were still alive. At age 82, Romano would be elderly but potentially still able to answer questions. Brennan would be around 78. She called NYPD records to verify current addresses. Vincent Romano was listed as deceased in 1998, but Harold Brennan still lived in Queens, the same address he'd had in 1985. The next morning brought DNA confirmation. Dr. Valdez called Martinez at 7 a.m. Positive match on the dental records and DNA. The remains are definitely Detective Michael Kozlowski. Cause of death appears to be blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. Martinez immediately drove to Queens to interview Harold Brennan. The address led to a modest house in Flushing, where she found an elderly man tending his garden. "Mr. Brennan, Detective Martinez, New York State Police. I'd like to ask you some questions about Detective Michael Kozlowski." Brennan's face went pale. "Kozlowski? That was 17 years ago. Why are you asking about him now?" "We found his body yesterday. He was murdered, Mr. Brennan, hidden in a barrel on a farm upstate. I think you know something about what happened to him." Brennan set down his gardening tools slowly. "Detective, I'm an old man. Whatever happened back then, it's over now. It's not over for his family, Mr. Brennan. His children grew up without a father. His wife spent 17 years not knowing if he was alive or dead. Someone killed a police officer and hid his body. That person needs to answer for what they did." Martinez could see the internal struggle on Brennan's weathered face. After several minutes of silence, he finally spoke. "Detective Kozlowski was getting too close to something he shouldn't have been investigating. The construction connection." Harold Brennan invited Martinez into his modest living room, decorated with family photos and certificates from his 30-year career with the Department of Buildings. He moved slowly, his arthritis evident as he settled into his recliner. "Detective Kozlowski contacted me in September 1985, Brennan began, his voice barely above a whisper. He'd been tracking stolen construction equipment and somehow connected it to projects I'd been inspecting. Martinez pulled out her notebook. "What exactly was being stolen, and how were you involved?" "Barch, Romano Construction was winning city contracts with unreasonably low bids. They'd start projects, then claim they needed additional funds for unforeseen complications. The city always approved the overruns because Romano was politically connected." Brennan explained that Romano's operation was sophisticated. They would steal expensive equipment from competing construction sites, use it on their own projects, then report it as purchased equipment to inflate their costs for city reimbursement. Vincent Romano had connections with city council members, the mayor's office, even some judges. When contractors complained about the thefts, their complaints got buried in bureaucracy. Romano's projects always got priority approval. Martinez asked about Brennan's specific role. "As building inspector, I was supposed to verify that Romano was using the equipment they claimed to purchase. Vincent offered me money to overlook discrepancies in serial numbers and purchase receipts." "How much money?" $5,000 per project. In 1985, that was substantial for a city employee making $32,000 a year. I have two daughters who needed college tuition. Brennan's hands shook as he described the arrangement. Romano would provide falsified receipts showing equipment purchases, and Brennan would sign off on inspections without thoroughly checking serial numbers against purchase records. Detective Kozlowski figured it out by comparing equipment serial numbers from theft reports with inspection records from Romano's sites. He found over 40 pieces of stolen equipment being used on city projects. Martinez reviewed her copy of Kozlowski's notes. His records show he'd identified nearly $2 million in stolen equipment being used by Romano Construction. That's serious money. Vincent Romano wasn't just stealing equipment for his own use. He was running a resale operation. Stolen equipment would be repainted, serial numbers altered, then sold to contractors in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Brennan described Romano's warehouse operation near the Hudson River. He had mechanics who specialized in altering equipment identification. They'd change serial numbers, repaint machinery, create fake purchase documentation. Who else was involved in this operation? Romano's nephew, Tony Romano, managed the day-to-day operations. Vincent's brother-in-law, Peter Castellano, handled the resales. And there was a guy named Mickey Torres who coordinated the actual thefts. Suddenly, Martinez asked about the meeting Kozlowski had arranged for October 3, 1985. Brennan's expression grew more troubled. Kozlowski called me the day before, said he had enough evidence to bring down Romano's entire operation, but he wanted to offer me a deal if I cooperated with the investigation. What kind of deal? Reduced charges in exchange for testimony against Romano and the others. He said I could avoid prison time if I helped them recover the stolen equipment and identify all the people involved. Brennan had agreed to meet Kozlowski at Pier 47, Romano Construction's warehouse facility. Kozlowski wanted me to wear a wire and get Romano to admit to the equipment theft operation. Did you tell Romano about the meeting? Brennan's silence answered the question. After several minutes, he nodded slowly. Vincent called me that morning. Said he'd heard rumors that someone was asking questions about our arrangement. I was scared, Detective. I had a family to protect. So you told Romano that Kozlowski was planning to arrest him? I told him that a detective had been asking about equipment serial numbers and wanted to meet with me. Vincent said he'd handle the situation. Martinez pressed for details about what happened on October 3rd. Brennan explained that he'd driven to Pier 47 as scheduled, but arrived 30 minutes early to warn Romano. Vincent was waiting with Tony and two other men I didn't recognize. They had baseball bats and seemed prepared for trouble. When Kozlowski arrived at 3 p.m., he parked his unmarked police car near the warehouse entrance. Romano and his men were hidden behind shipping containers. Detective Kozlowski approached the warehouse looking for me. He was carrying a briefcase with what I assumed were arrest warrants and evidence documents. What happened next? Tony Romano came up behind Kozlowski while he was calling my name. Hit him with a baseball bat from behind. Kozlowski went down immediately. Brennan described how Romano and his men quickly loaded the unconscious detective into the back of a van. They also took his police car and briefcase. Vincent told me to go home and forget what I'd seen. Said if I ever mentioned it to anyone, my family would end up like Kozlowski. Martinez asked about the blue barrel. Where did they get the barrel? And who decided to bury it upstate? Vincent owned property throughout New York State. He'd bought the farm from a city friend who owed him money. Said it was a perfect place to dispose of problems. Brennan explained that Romano had used the upstate property before. Whenever equipment needed to be hidden or destroyed, Vincent would take it to the farm. He had Tony dig holes and bury anything that might connect them to the theft operation. Did you ever see Detective Kozlowski's body? No. Vincent told me the next day that Kozlowski was dead and buried where nobody would ever find him. He made it clear that my silence was the only thing keeping my family safe. Martinez asked why Brennan was willing to talk now, 17 years later. Vincent died in 1998 from cancer. Tony Romano was killed in a car accident in 2001. Most of the people who could hurt my family are gone. What about Peter Castellano and Mickey Torres? Peter moved to Florida in the 1990s. Mickey disappeared in 1987. Vincent claimed he relocated to avoid police attention, but I always suspected he was killed to eliminate a witness. Brennan provided Martinez with addresses and phone numbers for people who might have additional information about Romano's operation. He also described the location of Romano's warehouse and the upstate property. "Detective, I've lived with this guilt for 17 years. I know my cooperation led to a good man's death. I can't bring back Detective Kozlowski, but maybe I can help his family get justice." Martinez assured Brennan that his cooperation would be noted in her report. However, she also informed him that he could still face charges related to the original conspiracy and accessory to murder. "I understand, Detective. I'm 82 years old. If I have to spend my remaining years in prison to make this right, so be it." As Martinez prepared to leave, Brennan handed her a small notebook. "I kept records of all the projects where I falsified inspections and the payments Romano made to me. Maybe it will help your investigation." The notebook contained detailed entries spanning 3 years, documenting nearly 50 projects where Romano Construction had used stolen equipment with Brennan's approval. Following the money trail, Martinez returned to the state police barracks with Brennan's notebook and immediately began cross-referencing the documented projects with city construction records from 1983 to 1985. The scope of Romano's operation was far larger than Kozlowski's original investigation had revealed. Detective Captain Michael Stevens assigned Martinez 2 additional investigators, Detective Luis Rivera, who specialized in financial crimes, and Detective Carol Thompson, an expert in organized crime investigations. Rivera began analyzing the financial records while Thompson focused on identifying surviving members of Romano's organization. Martinez coordinated the overall investigation and maintained contact with the Kozlowski family. The team's first breakthrough came from city archives. Rivera discovered that Romano Construction had received over $47 million in city contracts between 1983 and 1986, making it one of New York's largest municipal contractors during that period. "The financial patterns are consistent with equipment fraud," Rivera explained during their morning briefing. Romano would submit low initial bids, then request cost modifications claiming equipment rental expenses that were actually for stolen machinery. Thompson had located Peter Castellano in Boca Raton, Florida. Castellano is 79, retired, living in a senior community. Public records show he moved to Florida in 1993, not the 1990s like Brennan claimed. Martinez decided to interview Castellano before he learned about the investigation through media coverage. She flew to Florida the next morning, accompanied by Thompson. They found Castellano at his condominium complex, sitting by the pool reading a newspaper. When Martinez showed her badge, Castellano's relaxed demeanor immediately changed. "Mr. Castellano, we're investigating the murder of NYPD Detective Michael Kozlowski. We found his body yesterday, and witnesses have implicated you in a criminal conspiracy involving your brother-in-law, Vincent Romano." Castellano stood up slowly, steadying himself against a chair. "Detective Kozlowski? That was almost 20 years ago. Vincent told me he'd relocated to witness protection." "Vincent Romano lied to you, Mr. Castellano. Detective Kozlowski was murdered on October 3, 1985. His body was buried in a barrel on Romano's upstate property." Thompson showed Castellano photos of the crime scene and the recovered evidence. His face went pale as he recognized Kozlowski's badge and uniform. "Vincent never told me anyone was killed. He said Kozlowski had been convinced to drop his investigation in exchange for a transfer to another precinct." Martinez and Thompson pressed for details about Castellano's role in Romano's operation. He explained that his job was managing the resale of stolen equipment to contractors in other states. "Vincent would call me when equipment was ready for sale. I'd drive trucks to New Jersey or Pennsylvania and deliver machinery to buyers who didn't ask questions about documentation." "How much money did this operation generate?" "Over 3 years, probably $8 to $10 million. Vincent kept most of it, but I received about 10% for handling the resales." Castellano described the sophisticated network Romano had established. He had contacts with contractors throughout the Northeast who were willing to buy equipment at below-market prices without proper documentation. Did you know the equipment was stolen? Vincent told me it was surplus from completed projects. I suspected something wasn't right when serial numbers were always filed off or painted over. But I didn't ask questions. Thompson asked about Tony Romano's role in the operation. Castellano confirmed that Tony coordinated the actual thefts and managed the warehouse facility. Tony was ruthless. He'd recruit people to steal equipment, usually guys with gambling debts or drug problems who needed quick money. He'd pay them a few thousand per theft, then sell the equipment for $50,000 or $60,000. Martinez asked about Mickey Torres, the coordinator Brennan had mentioned. Castellano's expression darkened. Mickey worked directly for Tony. He'd scout construction sites, identify valuable equipment, and plan the thefts. Smart guy, but he got nervous after the Kozlowski thing. What happened to Mickey Torres? He started asking too many questions about what happened to the detective. Tony told Vincent that Mickey was becoming unreliable. Castellano described Mickey's disappearance in detail. In March 1987, Mickey was supposed to meet Tony at the warehouse to plan a major theft. Tony called me later that day, said Mickey never showed up. Did you believe Tony's story? No. Mickey was too professional to simply not show up for a planned operation. I think Tony killed him to eliminate a witness who knew too much about Kozlowski's murder. Thompson asked about the warehouse facility and whether evidence might still exist there. Castellano explained that Romano had closed the operation in 1988 and sold the warehouse property. After Kozlowski's disappearance, Vincent became paranoid. He moved equipment to different locations and eventually shut down the entire theft operation. Where did he move the equipment? Some went to a storage facility in Queens, some to the upstate farm. Vincent had Tony destroy anything that couldn't be easily sold. Martinez asked for specific addresses and names of people who might have additional information. Castellano provided locations for the Queens storage facility and names of contractors who had purchased stolen equipment. Detective, I know I'm admitting to serious crimes, but I never knew anyone was murdered. If I'd known Vincent had killed a police officer, I would never have continued working with him. Thompson asked about Romano's political connections and how the operation had avoided law enforcement attention for so long. Vincent had friends in city government, guys who owed him favors from when he was starting out. He'd do construction work for their homes at below cost, then they'd help him with permits and contracts. Castellano named several city officials who had received personal benefits from Romano, including 2 city council members and a deputy mayor. The city inspector, Harold Brennan, was just one of many people Vincent had on his payroll. He also paid off security guards at construction sites and clerks in the permits office. Martinez asked about Vincent Romano's death in 1998 and whether he'd ever expressed remorse about Kozlowski's murder. Vincent got cancer and knew he was dying. In his final months, he told me he regretted what happened to the detective. Said it was the only murder he'd ever been involved in. Did he mention where Kozlowski's body was buried? He said the detective was buried where nobody would ever find him, somewhere upstate where Vincent owned property. As the interview concluded, Martinez informed Castellano that he would likely face charges related to the conspiracy and equipment fraud. However, his cooperation could result in reduced penalties, given his age and the time that had passed. I'm 79 years old, Detective. I've been carrying this guilt for 20 years. If I have to face consequences now, at least Detective Kozlowski's family will finally know what happened to him. Martinez and Thompson obtained signed statements from Castellano and arranged for him to return to New York for formal questioning by prosecutors. On the flight back, Martinez reviewed the growing evidence. They now had testimony from 2 key witnesses, financial records documenting the fraud, and physical evidence from the crime scene. We need to locate that Queens storage facility and see if any evidence from Romano's operation still exists, Thompson suggested. Martinez agreed. We also need to track down any surviving contractors who bought stolen equipment. Someone might remember details that could strengthen our case. The investigation was expanding beyond a simple murder case into a comprehensive examination of municipal corruption and organized theft that had operated for years with impunity. Uncovering the network. Back in New York, Martinez and her team began systematically investigating the network of corruption that had enabled Romano's operation. Rivera had obtained warrants for city construction records, banking documents, and property deeds related to Romano Construction. Their first major discovery came from analyzing Romano's bank records from 1983 to 1986. The company had deposited over $60 million during that period, far exceeding the documented income from legitimate construction contracts. "The money laundering pattern is obvious," Rivera explained to the team. Romano would deposit cash from equipment sales, then write checks to shell companies that existed only on paper. Thompson had located the Queen storage facility that Castellano mentioned. The current owner, Ahmad Hassan, had purchased the property in 1989 and still operated it as a storage business. "Mr. Hassan, we're investigating crimes that occurred at this facility in the 1980s. We'd like to examine any records from the previous owner and check if any equipment remains from that period." Hassan cooperated fully, providing access to storage units that hadn't been rented since Romano's time. In Unit 47, they discovered a treasure trove of evidence: boxes of falsified equipment receipts, photographs of stolen machinery, and handwritten notes documenting thefts. Among the documents was a detailed inventory in Tony Romano's handwriting, listing over 200 pieces of stolen construction equipment with their original theft locations and resale prices. Martinez found a folder labeled "Problem Situations" that contained newspaper clippings about Detective Kozlowski's disappearance and handwritten notes about eliminating complications. "This directly connects Tony Romano to knowledge of Kozlowski's murder," Thompson observed, photographing the evidence. Rivera discovered financial records showing payments to city officials beyond Harold Brennan. Romano was paying monthly consulting fees to at least 12 city employees between 1983 and 1987. The list included building inspectors, permit clerks, security supervisors at city construction sites, and even a records clerk in the police property division. Martinez realized the corruption network had protected Romano's operation by providing advance warning of investigations and ensuring that theft reports were misfiled or delayed. Their investigation received an unexpected break when David Kozlowski, the murdered detective's son, called Martinez. "Detective, I've been going through my father's personal papers that we stored in our basement. I found something that might be important to your investigation." David had discovered a safety deposit box key and bank documentation that his family had overlooked for 17 years. The box contained backup copies of all Kozlowski's investigation notes and photographs of stolen equipment. "Your father was thorough," Martinez told David after reviewing the contents. "He documented everything and kept copies of all his evidence in a secure location." Among Kozlowski's papers was a list of license plate numbers photographed at Romano's warehouse facility. Rivera ran the plates through DMV records and discovered they belonged to vehicles registered to several of Romano's business associates. Martinez decided to interview the surviving associates whose names appeared repeatedly in the evidence. The first was Frank Torino, who had worked as Romano's accountant from 1982 to 1987. They found Torino, now 74, living in a nursing home in Brooklyn. Despite his advanced age, his memory of Romano's operation remained sharp. "Vincent Romano ran the most sophisticated theft and money laundering operation I ever encountered," Torino told Martinez. He understood that the key to success was corrupting the right people in city government. Torino explained Romano's systematic approach to corruption. He'd identify city employees who had financial problems or personal vulnerabilities, then offer them money or favors in exchange for cooperation. How did Romano select his targets for equipment theft? Tony would study construction sites for weeks, learning the schedules, security procedures, and equipment locations. He had informants at various sites who would tip him off about valuable machinery. Torino confirmed that Romano's operation generated enormous profits. Between equipment resales and inflated city contracts, Vincent was making at least $3 million per year in illegal income. Did Romano ever mention Detective Kozlowski or what happened to him? "Vincent told me that a police detective had been eliminated for threatening the operation. He said it as a warning to ensure I remained loyal. Martinez asked about Romano's decision to kill Kozlowski rather than try to bribe or intimidate him. Vincent said the detective was incorruptible and had too much evidence to be scared off. He claimed killing Kozlowski was the only way to protect the operation. Torino provided additional details about the warehouse operation and the methods used to alter equipment identification. They had a professional mechanic named Eddie Santana who specialized in changing serial numbers and repainting machinery. Is Eddie Santana still alive? He died in a motorcycle accident in 1994. Vincent always suspected it wasn't really an accident, that someone wanted to eliminate another witness. Martinez asked about Tony Romano's death in 2001. According to Torino, Tony had become increasingly paranoid in his final years. Tony knew too much about Vincent's operation, including details about the detective's murder. When Vincent died in 1998, Tony lost his protection. Who do you think killed Tony Romano? Vincent had connections to organized crime families. When Tony became a liability after Vincent's death, those connections probably eliminated him. Torino explained that Romano's operation had ties to traditional organized crime, but Vincent maintained independence by sharing profits with established crime families. Vincent paid a percentage to the Colombo family for protection and access to their network of corrupt officials. In return, they stayed out of his construction business. As the interview concluded, Martinez asked Torino about any remaining evidence or witnesses who might provide additional information. Vincent kept detailed records of everything, including payments to city officials and documentation of major thefts. If those records still exist, they would provide evidence of the entire corruption network. Where would Romano keep such records? He had a safe in his house and another one at a private office he maintained separate from the construction company. The office was in Manhattan near City Hall. Martinez obtained Romano's home address from property records. The house had been sold to new owners in 1999, but she arranged to search the property for any hidden safes or documents. The search revealed a wall safe behind a painting in Romano's former office. Inside were financial records, photographs, and a handwritten confession letter that Romano had apparently prepared but never used. The letter detailed Romano's entire operation, named all his accomplices and the city officials he had corrupted, and admitted to ordering Detective Kozlowski's murder. Vincent Romano wrote this as insurance, Martinez realized. If he was ever arrested, he planned to use it to negotiate a plea deal by exposing everyone involved in the corruption network. The letter provided the final piece of evidence needed to close the case and potentially prosecute surviving members of the corruption network. The confession letter. Romano's confession letter, dated December 15, 1997, provided detailed information about every aspect of his criminal operation. Martinez and her team spent hours analyzing the handwritten document, which filled 23 pages with specific names, dates, and financial amounts. Detective Michael Kozlowski was killed on my orders because he threatened to destroy an operation that employed dozens of people and generated millions of dollars in revenue, Romano had written. I take full responsibility for his death and the suffering it caused his family. The letter described the events of October 3, 1985, in precise detail. Romano explained that Harold Brennan had called him that morning to report Kozlowski's planned meeting at Pier 47. I instructed my nephew Tony to assemble a team and eliminate Detective Kozlowski before he could arrest me or seize evidence from the warehouse facility. According to Romano's account, Tony recruited 2 additional men for the murder, Mickey Torres and Eddie Santana, the mechanic who altered equipment serial numbers. Tony struck Detective Kozlowski from behind with a baseball bat while the detective was looking for Harold Brennan. Kozlowski fell immediately and never regained consciousness. Romano detailed the disposal of Kozlowski's body. We placed the detective in a blue storage barrel and transported him to my farm property in upstate New York. Tony and Mickey buried the barrel in the northeastern section of the property. The letter also revealed Romano's disposal of other evidence. Detective Kozlowski's car was driven to Queens and abandoned in a parking garage after we removed all fingerprints and personal items. His briefcase contained arrest warrants and evidence that could have convicted me. Martinez found Romano's description of the briefcase's contents particularly significant. The detective had photographed our entire warehouse operation and identified most of our stolen equipment by serial number. He also had financial records proving our money laundering activities. Romano explained that he had burned Kozlowski's evidence and discontinued the theft operation for several months after the murder. The detective's death brought too much police attention to continue stealing equipment immediately. The confession letter named every city official Romano had corrupted during his operation. Beyond Harold Brennan, the list included 2 deputy mayors, 5 city council members, 12 building department employees, and 8 police department personnel. I paid over $2 million in bribes between 1983 and 1987, Romano wrote. These payments ensured that theft reports were delayed, inspection records were falsified, and my construction contracts received priority approval. Martinez cross-referenced the names with city employment records. Remarkably, 3 of the named officials were still alive and working in city government in 2002. Deputy Mayor Richard Castellanos had received monthly payments of $3,000 for ensuring Romano's contracts were approved without competitive bidding. City Council member Patricia Williams had been paid $5,000 per project for her support of zoning variances that benefited Romano's developments. Police Captain Thomas Murphy had received regular payments for ensuring that equipment theft reports involving Romano's sites were classified as low priority. Rivera calculated the total scope of Romano's criminal enterprise. Between stolen equipment, inflated contracts, and money laundering, we're looking at over $80 million in illegal activity between 1983 and 1987. Thompson focused on identifying surviving members of Romano's criminal organization. Most of the key players are dead, but we have 3 potential witnesses still alive: Harold Brennan, Peter Castellano, and Eddie Santana's widow, Maria. Martinez decided to interview Maria Santana before the media learned about the confession letter. They found her working at a restaurant in Queens, where she had been employed since her husband's death in 1994. Mrs. Santana, we're investigating the murder of Detective Michael Kozlowski. Your late husband Eddie worked for Vincent Romano and was present when the detective was killed. Maria Santana immediately became defensive. My husband died 8 years ago. Whatever he did for Vincent Romano ended when Vincent died. Martinez showed her Romano's confession letter and the section naming Eddie as one of the men who helped dispose of Kozlowski's body. Eddie never told me about anyone being murdered. He said he just changed serial numbers on equipment for Mr. Romano. According to Romano's written confession, Eddie helped bury Detective Kozlowski's body at Romano's farm in 1985. Maria's composure cracked as she read Romano's handwritten account. Eddie was scared of Vincent Romano. Said Vincent had connections to dangerous people who would hurt our family if Eddie didn't cooperate. She explained that Eddie had tried to quit working for Romano several times, but was threatened with violence if he left the organization. After 1985, Eddie became different. He was nervous all the time, had nightmares, started drinking heavily. I knew something terrible had happened, but he wouldn't tell me what. Martinez asked about Eddie's death in 1994. The official report listed it as a motorcycle accident, but Maria had always suspected otherwise. Eddie was an experienced rider. He'd owned motorcycles for 20 years and never had an accident. The crash happened on a straight road with perfect weather conditions. Did Eddie ever mention feeling threatened by Romano or anyone else? In 1993, Eddie told me he was thinking about talking to police about things he'd seen while working for Mr. Romano. 2 weeks later, someone broke into our house while we were sleeping. Maria described finding their house ransacked with a note warning Eddie to keep his mouth shut about old business. Eddie was killed in the motorcycle accident 3 months later. I always believed someone murdered Eddie to keep him quiet about Detective Kozlowski and the other things he'd seen. Martinez asked if Eddie had left any documents or evidence related to his work for Romano. Eddie kept a toolbox in our basement with work records and photographs. After he died, I was too scared to look through it carefully. Maria agreed to let Martinez examine Eddie's toolbox. Among the contents were photographs of the Romano warehouse facility, including images of Detective Kozlowski's car being processed after the murder. One photograph showed Eddie and Tony Romano loading a blue barrel into a van on October 3, 1985. Another showed the same barrel being unloaded at what appeared to be Romano's upstate farm. These photographs provide visual evidence corroborating Romano's written confession, Thompson observed. Martinez found Eddie's personal notes documenting his increasing fear of Romano's organization. His final entry, dated March 1994, read, "VR thinks I know too much about the cop. Tony says I need to have an accident soon." The evidence was overwhelming. Romano's confession letter, combined with witness testimony and physical evidence, proved that Detective Kozlowski had been murdered by Romano's organization in a conspiracy that included multiple accomplices and a systematic cover-up. Martinez called District Attorney Rebecca Patterson to discuss prosecution options. "We have enough evidence to file murder charges against the surviving conspirators, but most of the primary defendants are deceased. What about the city officials who were bribed?" Patterson asked. "3 are still alive and employed by the city. We have documented evidence of their corruption, including Romano's confession letter and financial records showing the payments." Patterson scheduled a meeting with Martinez's team to review all evidence and determine which charges could still be prosecuted, given the statute of limitations and the passage of time. The investigation had revealed a massive corruption network that had operated with impunity for years, protected by bribes and intimidation. Detective Kozlowski's murder had been the ultimate consequence of his determination to expose the truth. As Martinez prepared for the meeting with the DA, she reflected on the impact the case would have on Kozlowski's family and the city's reputation. Justice had been delayed for 17 years, but the truth was finally emerging. Closing the circle, District Attorney Rebecca Patterson assembled a team of prosecutors to review the evidence against surviving members of Romano's conspiracy. The meeting included Assistant DA Jonathan Miller, who specialized in corruption cases, and Assistant DA Catherine Walsh, who handled murder prosecutions. Martinez presented the complete case file: Romano's confession letter, witness testimony from Brennan and Castellano, financial records documenting bribes, and physical evidence from the farm and warehouse locations. The evidence clearly establishes that Detective Kozlowski was murdered by Vincent Romano's organization, Patterson concluded. However, most of the perpetrators are deceased, which limits our prosecution options. Miller reviewed the corruption evidence. "We can file charges against the 3 surviving city officials who received bribes: Deputy Mayor Castellanos, Council Member Williams, and Captain Murphy can all be prosecuted for conspiracy and corruption." Walsh examined the murder evidence. Harold Brennan can be charged as an accessory to murder. His cooperation led directly to Kozlowski's death, even if he didn't participate in the actual killing. Patterson assigned additional prosecutors to handle the complex case. "We're going to seek justice for Detective Kozlowski and send a message that corruption will not be tolerated, regardless of how much time has passed." The first arrests were made on July 30, 2002. Deputy Mayor Richard Castellanos was taken into custody at City Hall, while Patricia Williams was arrested at her home in Queens. Captain Murphy, now retired, was arrested at his residence in Staten Island. Harold Brennan surrendered voluntarily at Martinez's office, accompanied by his attorney. Despite his cooperation with the investigation, he was formally charged as an accessory to murder. The arrests generated massive media coverage. Detective Kozlowski's murder had been one of New York's most famous unsolved cases, and the revelation of widespread corruption shocked city residents. Elena Vasquez, Kozlowski's widow, held a press conference with her adult children. "For 17 years we've wondered what happened to Michael. Now we know he died trying to protect the city from corruption and theft." David Kozlowski, now a firefighter like his father had been a police officer, spoke about the impact of finally learning the truth. "My father was killed because he refused to be corrupted. He died doing his job, protecting the citizens of New York." Martinez attended the press conference and was asked about the investigation's significance. Detective Kozlowski's murder exposed a network of corruption that cost the city millions of dollars and undermined public trust in government. The investigation continued as prosecutors built cases against each defendant. Peter Castellano returned from Florida and agreed to testify against the surviving conspirators in exchange for reduced charges. Romano's operation couldn't have functioned without corrupt city officials, Castellano testified before the grand jury. The bribes ensured that theft reports were ignored and falsified contracts were approved. Harold Brennan's testimony provided crucial details about the corruption network. Vincent Romano told me that he owned dozens of city employees. He bragged that he could get any permit approved or any complaint dismissed. The grand jury issued indictments against all surviving members of Romano's organization. The charges included murder conspiracy, racketeering, money laundering, and corruption of public officials. Deputy Mayor Castellanos hired prominent defense attorney Michael Roberts, who argued that the statute of limitations had expired on most corruption charges. However, murder charges have no statute of limitations, and Castellanos was connected to the murder through his role in the conspiracy. Patricia Williams claimed she had received the money from Romano for legitimate consulting services. However, bank records showed the payments began immediately after she voted to approve zoning variances for Romano's projects. Captain Murphy's defense team argued that he had simply failed to prioritize certain theft reports, not actively participated in corruption. However, Romano's confession letter specifically mentioned Murphy's role in suppressing investigations. As the legal proceedings continued, Martinez worked with city auditors to calculate the total cost of Romano's corruption. The final estimate exceeded $100 million in stolen equipment, inflated contracts, and fraudulent payments. The city began civil proceedings to recover money from Romano's estate and the assets of convicted conspirators. Romano's construction company had been dissolved after his death, but his property and investments were seized to compensate victims. Martinez also worked with NYPD Internal Affairs to identify any remaining corruption within the police department. Romano's records revealed that his influence had extended to multiple precincts and departments. In September 2002, Detective Kozlowski's remains were finally buried with full police honors. Hundreds of officers attended the funeral, along with city officials and community members who respected his sacrifice. Elena Vasquez spoke at the funeral service. Michael died 17 years ago, but his commitment to justice has finally triumphed. The people who killed him and tried to cover up their crimes have been exposed. The investigation had profound effects on city government. New oversight procedures were implemented for construction contracts, and background checks were strengthened for employees in sensitive positions. Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who had taken office in 2002, used the Romano case as an example of why city government needed transparency and accountability. Detective Kozlowski's murder shows what happens when corruption is allowed to flourish unchecked. Martinez received commendations for her work on the case, but she focused on the significance of finally providing answers to Kozlowski's family. After 17 years, his children can finally understand that their father died as a hero. The Romano investigation also led to reviews of other unsolved cases involving police officers. Several cold cases were reopened based on information discovered in Romano's records. As autumn 2002 approached, Martinez reflected on the investigation's impact. A single discovery by farmer Robert Chen had exposed decades of corruption and solved one of New York's most notorious cold cases. The truth about Detective Michael Kozlowski's murder had finally emerged, bringing justice to his family and accountability to those who had betrayed the public trust. The trial begins. On November 4, 2002, the trial of Harold Brennan, Richard Castellanos, Patricia Williams, and Thomas Murphy began in Manhattan's Supreme Court. Judge Patricia Morrison presided over what media dubbed the trial of the century, due to its revelation of systematic corruption in city government. Lead prosecutor Jonathan Miller opened with a dramatic presentation of the evidence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about the murder of a police officer who died trying to protect the city from thieves and corrupt officials. Miller displayed photographs of Detective Kozlowski's remains and the blue barrel where his body had been hidden for 17 years. Detective Kozlowski was killed because he threatened to expose a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of city government. Defense attorney Michael Roberts, representing Deputy Mayor Castellanos, argued that his client had received legitimate consulting payments from Romano Construction. Mr. Castellanos provided valuable advice to Romano about city regulations and permit procedures. However, Prosecutor Miller quickly dismantled this argument by showing bank records proving that payments to Castellanos increased dramatically after he approved controversial zoning variances for Romano's projects. Martinez testified for 3 days, walking the jury through the investigation step by step. She described finding Kozlowski's body, interviewing witnesses, and discovering Romano's confession letter. Vincent Romano's handwritten confession names each defendant as a participant in the conspiracy that led to Detective Kozlowski's murder. Martinez explained to the jury. Harold Brennan took the stand as the prosecution's key witness. Despite being charged as an accessory to murder, his cooperation agreement required him to testify truthfully about the conspiracy. "I told Vincent Romano that Detective Kozlowski was planning to arrest him," Brennan admitted. "I knew Romano was violent and would probably hurt the detective, but I was scared for my own family." In Davide, Brennan's testimony provided crucial details about the corruption network. Romano bragged that he owned city officials the way other people owned cars. He could buy whatever influence he needed. Defense attorneys tried to discredit Brennan by pointing out his obvious self-interest in cooperating with prosecutors. However, his testimony was supported by extensive documentation and physical evidence. Peter Castellano testified about Romano's equipment theft operation and the money laundering network. "Vincent Romano was the most sophisticated criminal I ever encountered. He understood exactly how to corrupt city government." The prosecution presented Romano's confession letter as evidence, reading key sections aloud to the jury. Romano's detailed admission of ordering Kozlowski's murder was particularly damaging to the defendants. Detective Kozlowski was an honest cop who couldn't be bought or intimidated, Romano had written. "Killing him was the only way to protect our operation from his investigation." Defense attorneys argued that Romano's confession letter was unreliable because it was written by a dying man who might have been seeking to protect living accomplices by accepting responsibility. However, the prosecution demonstrated that Romano's confession was corroborated by witness testimony, financial records, and physical evidence from multiple crime scenes. Maria Santana testified about her husband Eddie's involvement in disposing of Kozlowski's body and his subsequent murder in 1994. Eddie was killed because he knew too much about Detective Kozlowski's murder. The prosecution presented photographs from Eddie Santana's toolbox showing the blue barrel being loaded and transported to Romano's farm. These images provided visual confirmation of Romano's written confession. Captain Murphy's defense team argued that he had simply failed to prioritize certain theft reports due to heavy caseloads, not actively participated in corruption. However, Romano's records showed Murphy received monthly payments totaling over $60,000. Captain Murphy wasn't just passively negligent, Prosecutor Catherine Walsh explained to the jury. He actively suppressed investigations that threatened Romano's criminal operation. Patricia Williams claimed she had voted on zoning issues based on their merits, not because of payments from Romano. However, voting records showed she supported Romano's projects even when they violated established city planning guidelines. The prosecution demonstrated that Williams received payments within days of each favorable vote, establishing a clear pattern of quid pro quo corruption. Deputy Mayor Castellanos maintained that he had provided legitimate consulting services to Romano Construction. However, city records showed that he had used his official position to expedite permits and bypass competitive bidding requirements. Mr. Castellanos sold his office to Vincent Romano, Miller argued. He used his position as deputy mayor to enrich himself while taxpayers paid inflated prices for city construction projects. The defense presented character witnesses for each defendant, emphasizing their years of public service and contributions to their communities. However, these testimonials were overshadowed by the evidence of their involvement in the conspiracy. As the trial progressed, additional evidence emerged. City auditors testified about the financial impact of Romano's corruption, calculating losses exceeding $120 million. FBI financial analyst Robert Chang explained Romano's money laundering operation to the jury. Romano used a network of shell companies and bank accounts to convert illegal proceeds into apparently legitimate business income. The prosecution called Detective Kozlowski's adult children to testify about the impact of their father's murder on their family. David Kozlowski described growing up without knowing whether his father was alive or dead. For 17 years, we wondered if Dad had abandoned us or been killed. Learning the truth is painful, but at least we finally know he died trying to protect the city. Maria Kozlowski, now a social worker, spoke about her father's dedication to honest police work. Dad always said that cops have to be above corruption because people depend on them for protection. Elena Vasquez, Kozlowski's widow, testified about the family's 17-year search for answers. I never remarried because I always hoped Michael might somehow still be alive. Now I know he's been dead all these years. The emotional testimony about Kozlowski's family clearly affected the jury. Several jurors were visibly moved during Elena's description of raising 2 children alone, while wondering about their father's fate. Defense attorneys struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence and emotional impact of the victim impact testimony. Their strategy focused on minimizing their clients' roles in the conspiracy rather than denying participation entirely. As the prosecution rested its case, the evidence clearly established that Romano's criminal organization had operated with the active cooperation of corrupt city officials, leading directly to Detective Kozlowski's murder. Verdicts and consequences. After 6 weeks of testimony, closing arguments began on December 16, 2002. Prosecutor Jonathan Miller summarized the evidence against each defendant, emphasizing their roles in the conspiracy that led to Detective Kozlowski's murder. Harold Brennan betrayed Detective Kozlowski by warning Vincent Romano about the planned arrest. This betrayal directly caused Kozlowski's death, Miller told the jury. Miller addressed each defendant's culpability. Richard Castellanos used his position as deputy mayor to protect Romano's criminal operation. Patricia Williams sold her vote on the city council. Thomas Murphy suppressed police investigations. The prosecutor emphasized the devastating impact of the corruption network. These defendants didn't just steal money from taxpayers. Their actions enabled Romano's criminal enterprise and contributed to the murder of a dedicated police officer. Defense attorney Michael Roberts made his closing argument for Deputy Mayor Castellanos. My client made poor decisions and accepted money he shouldn't have taken, but he never intended for anyone to be murdered. Roberts argued that Castellanos had been manipulated by Romano and hadn't understood the full scope of the criminal operation. However, this argument was weakened by evidence showing Castellanos had actively helped Romano for over 4 years. Patricia Williams's attorney, Sarah Goldman, argued that her client's votes on zoning issues were based on legitimate planning considerations. Councilwoman Williams genuinely believed these projects would benefit the city's development. However, the prosecution had established that Williams received payments within days of each favorable vote, making the corruption connection undeniable. Captain Murphy's defense team argued that he had been overwhelmed by heavy caseloads and hadn't deliberately suppressed investigations. Captain Murphy was a dedicated officer who made mistakes but didn't intend to participate in murder. Prosecutor Catherine Walsh countered during rebuttal arguments. The evidence shows systematic corruption, not innocent mistakes. These defendants knew they were participating in a criminal conspiracy. Harold Brennan's attorney had the most difficult case since his client had already admitted his role in the conspiracy. The defense focused on Brennan's cooperation and his genuine remorse for his actions. Mr. Brennan knows he made a terrible mistake that cost Detective Kozlowski his life. His cooperation has helped bring justice to the other members of this conspiracy. The jury began deliberations on December 20, 2002. After 3 days of discussions, they returned verdicts on all defendants. Harold Brennan was found guilty of accessory to murder and conspiracy. The jury accepted that his warning to Romano had directly led to Kozlowski's death, regardless of his subsequent cooperation. Richard Castellanos was found guilty of conspiracy, racketeering, and corruption. The evidence of his extensive cooperation with Romano's operation over 4 years convinced the jury of his central role in the scheme. Patricia Williams was found guilty of conspiracy and corruption. The clear pattern of payments following favorable votes established her guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Thomas Murphy was found guilty of conspiracy and corruption. Despite his defense team's arguments, the jury concluded that his suppression of investigations was deliberate, not accidental. Judge Patricia Morrison scheduled sentencing for February 2003. The convictions represented the successful prosecution of a corruption network that had operated for decades with impunity. Elena Vasquez and her children attended the verdict reading. "Justice has finally been served for Michael," Elena said outside the courthouse. "These people destroyed our family, but they can't escape the consequences anymore." City officials implemented immediate reforms in response to the trial revelations. New oversight procedures were established for construction contracts, and ethics training became mandatory for all city employees. Mayor Bloomberg announced the creation of an independent inspector general's office to investigate corruption and ensure accountability in city government. The Romano case shows why we need constant vigilance against corruption. Detective Martinez received the NYPD Medal of Honor for her work solving the Kozlowski case. However, she focused on the significance of providing closure to Kozlowski's family rather than personal recognition. This case shows that justice can prevail even after 17 years. Detective Kozlowski's family deserved to know the truth about his death. In January 2003, additional arrests were made based on evidence discovered during the Romano investigation. 2 former building inspectors and a construction company executive were charged with participating in related corruption schemes. The investigation had revealed that Romano's operation was part of a larger network of corruption that had affected multiple city departments and cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars. Civil lawsuits were filed against Romano's estate and the convicted conspirators. The city sought to recover money lost through inflated contracts and fraudulent payments to corrupt officials. Kozlowski's family filed wrongful death suits against all participants in the conspiracy. "No amount of money can bring back our father, but these people need to pay for destroying our family," David Kozlowski explained. On February 14, 2003, Judge Morrison sentenced the convicted defendants. Harold Brennan received 15 years in prison for accessory to murder, despite his cooperation with the investigation. Mr. Brennan's actions directly led to Detective Kozlowski's death, Judge Morrison explained. While the court recognizes his cooperation, the severity of the consequences requires substantial punishment. Richard Castellanos was sentenced to 25 years in prison for his leadership role in the corruption conspiracy. His extensive abuse of public office and the duration of his criminal activity warranted the harsh sentence. Patricia Williams received 12 years in prison for corruption and conspiracy. Her betrayal of public trust as an elected official demanded significant punishment despite her relatively minor role in the scheme. Thomas Murphy was sentenced to 18 years in prison for corruption and conspiracy. As a police captain, his suppression of investigations had enabled Romano's criminal operation to continue for years. The sentences sent a clear message about the consequences of corruption and the importance of public integrity. City officials and law enforcement personnel across the country studied the Romano case as an example of how corruption can lead to tragic consequences. Detective Kozlowski's badge number, 4789, was retired permanently by the NYPD. A memorial plaque was installed at his former precinct honoring his sacrifice and dedication to honest police work. Elena Vasquez established a scholarship fund in her husband's memory to support children of police officers killed in the line of duty. Michael died protecting the city from corruption. This scholarship will help other police families who have made similar sacrifices. Remember, the Romano investigation became a case study in police academies and law schools nationwide. It demonstrated how one officer's dedication to justice could ultimately expose massive corruption even after his death. Martinez continued working cold cases and was promoted to lieutenant in recognition of her investigative skills. She often spoke to police recruits about the importance of integrity and persistence in solving difficult cases. Detective Kozlowski's case reminds us that we never stop fighting for justice, no matter how much time has passed or how powerful the people involved might be. The Romano corruption scandal had lasting effects on New York City government. Reform measures implemented after the trial helped prevent similar schemes and restored some public trust in city institutions. Aftermath and revelations. 6 months after the convictions, Detective Martinez received a call that would expand the Romano investigation even further. FBI agent Patricia Hendricks contacted her about connections between Romano's operation and organized crime families in New York. Detective Martinez, we've been reviewing Romano's confession letter and financial records. We believe his operation was connected to a broader network of corruption involving multiple crime families. The FBI had been investigating organized crime influence in city construction projects for over a decade. Romano's detailed confession provided evidence of connections they had long suspected but couldn't prove. Agent Hendricks explained that Romano's payments to crime families had protected his operation from interference by rival criminals. Romano was paying tribute to both the Colombo and Genovese families for permission to operate in their territories. This revelation led to a joint FBI-NYPD task force to investigate organized crime corruption in city government. Martinez was assigned to the task force based on her expertise with the Romano case. The investigation revealed that Romano's operation was one of dozens of similar schemes operating throughout New York during the 1980s and 1990s. Construction industry corruption had cost the city over $1 billion during that period. In July 2003, federal prosecutors announced indictments against 12 additional people connected to Romano's organization. The charges included racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. Among those indicted was Frank Romano, Vincent's older brother, who had used his connections in the concrete industry to facilitate the equipment theft operation. Frank had avoided prosecution in the original case by claiming ignorance of his brother's criminal activities. However, Romano's confession letter revealed that Frank had been actively involved in laundering money through legitimate construction projects. Frank handled the paperwork to make stolen equipment appear legally purchased, Vincent had written. The expanded investigation also targeted corrupt officials in other city departments. Romano's records revealed bribes to employees in the Parks Department, Transportation Department, and even the Mayor's Office of Contracts. Deputy Mayor Castellanos, already serving his 25-year sentence, was questioned about additional corruption schemes. Facing potential federal charges, he agreed to cooperate with investigators. Vincent Romano's operation was just one part of a systematic culture of corruption that affected every major city department, Castellanos testified before a federal grand jury. His testimony led to investigations of construction projects spanning 3 decades. Federal prosecutors estimated that corruption had inflated the cost of city projects by at least 30% during this period. Elena Vasquez was contacted by prosecutors about the expanded investigation. Mrs. Vasquez, we're learning that your husband's murder was part of a much larger pattern of violence used to protect corruption networks. The investigation revealed that at least 6 other people had been killed to protect various corruption schemes between 1985 and 2000. Detective Kozlowski's murder was the most high-profile, but similar violence had eliminated other potential witnesses. Mickey Torres, the theft coordinator who disappeared in 1987, had been found dead in New Jersey in 1988. His murder had been classified as gang-related violence, but Romano's confession letter revealed it was ordered to eliminate a witness. Eddie Santana's motorcycle accident in 1994 was reclassified as homicide after forensic experts re-examined the crash site. Evidence suggested his motorcycle had been sabotaged to cause the fatal accident. In September 2003, the task force arrested Vincent Romano Jr., Vincent's son, who had continued some aspects of his father's operation after Vincent's death in 1998. Vincent Jr. had been laundering money through legitimate construction projects in New Jersey and Connecticut. Vincent Jr. learned the family business from his father and uncle, Agent Hendricks explained. He was using many of the same methods Romano Sr. had developed in the 1980s. The The arrest of Vincent Romano Jr. led to the discovery of additional evidence about his father's original operation. Hidden in his New Jersey office were backup copies of financial records detailing bribes to city officials. These records confirmed Romano Sr.'s confession letter and provided evidence against several officials who had escaped prosecution in the original case. Federal prosecutors used this evidence to file additional charges. Harold Brennan, serving his 15-year sentence, was questioned about other corruption schemes he might have witnessed. His cooperation led to investigations of building inspectors who had worked with other criminal organizations. Romano wasn't the only contractor paying bribes to city employees, Brennan testified. The corruption was so widespread that honest inspectors were actually rare. The task force investigation revealed that corruption in the construction industry had been institutionalized. New employees were often recruited into corrupt schemes as a condition of advancement or job security. Captain Murphy, serving his 18-year sentence, provided information about police department corruption. Romano had contacts in multiple precincts, Murphy testified. He could get information about investigations and ensure that his associates received warnings. This testimony led to internal affairs investigations of over 30 police officers who had worked during Romano's era. While most were already retired, several faced criminal charges for their participation in corruption schemes. Detective Martinez was promoted to captain in recognition of her work on the expanded investigation. She established new protocols for investigating corruption cases and training officers to recognize signs of organized crime influence. The Romano case became a model for investigating complex corruption networks. Martinez's methodical approach to following evidence and building cases against multiple defendants was studied by law enforcement agencies nationwide. In December 2003, federal prosecutors announced the largest corruption case in New York City history. 67 people were indicted on charges related to construction industry corruption, spanning 20 years. The indictments included current and former city officials, construction company executives, organized crime figures, and corrupt police officers. Romano's operation had been the center of a web of corruption that affected every aspect of city construction projects. Elena Vasquez attended the press conference announcing the indictments. Michael's death has exposed corruption that went far beyond what anyone imagined. His sacrifice has made the city safer and more honest. David and Maria Kozlowski spoke about their father's legacy. Dad died trying to stop one criminal operation, but his death has led to exposing an entire system of corruption, David said. The expanded investigation resulted in convictions of over 40 people and the recovery of more than $200 million in stolen taxpayer money. City construction projects were reformed with new oversight procedures and transparency requirements. Detective Kozlowski's name was added to the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial in Washington, D.C., honoring officers killed in the line of duty. His badge number 4789 became a symbol of integrity and dedication to justice. Martinez often reflected on the investigation's impact during speeches to police recruits. Detective Kozlowski's case shows that one honest officer can make a difference, even after death. His refusal to be corrupted ultimately brought down an entire criminal network. The Romano investigation continued influencing city government reform efforts years after the original case was solved. New ethics requirements, oversight procedures, and transparency measures were implemented based on lessons learned from the scandal. Legacy and justice. By August 2025, 23 years after Detective Michael Kozlowski's body was discovered, the impact of his case continued to resonate throughout New York City and law enforcement nationwide. Captain Sarah Martinez, now retired, often visited the memorial plaque at Kozlowski's former precinct to reflect on the investigation that defined her career. The Romano Corruption Network prosecutions had resulted in 93 convictions between 2003 and 2007. Federal and state prosecutors recovered over $400 million in stolen taxpayer money, making it one of the largest corruption cases in American history. Elena Vasquez, now 78, had become a prominent advocate for police families and government transparency. The scholarship fund she established in her husband's memory had provided college education for over 200 children of officers killed in the line of duty. Michael would be proud to know that his death led to reforms that have prevented corruption and protected other officers, Elena said during a recent interview. His sacrifice wasn't in vain. David Kozlowski had followed his father's path into public service, becoming fire commissioner for New York City in 2018. He frequently spoke about his father's legacy and the importance of integrity in public service. Growing up without my father was difficult, but understanding that he died fighting corruption has given meaning to his death. Every day I try to honor his memory by serving the city honestly. Maria Kozlowski became a federal prosecutor specializing in public corruption cases. She had successfully prosecuted dozens of corrupt officials, continuing her father's work of protecting taxpayers from dishonest government employees. Dad's case taught me that corruption destroys communities and betrays the public trust. My career is dedicated to ensuring that people like Vincent Romano can never again operate with impunity. Harold Brennan was released from prison in 2015 after serving 12 years of his 15-year sentence. Now 85, he lived quietly in upstate New York and occasionally spoke to criminal justice students about the consequences of corruption. "I made a terrible decision that cost Detective Kozlowski his life," Brennan said during a recent university presentation. "Young people need to understand that compromising your integrity can lead to devastating consequences." Richard Castellanos died in prison in 2019 while serving his 25-year sentence. Patricia Williams was released in 2015 and moved to Florida, where she worked as a community volunteer. Thomas Murphy was released in 2018 and became an advocate for police reform. The three surviving defendants had expressed remorse for their actions, but the consequences of their corruption extended far beyond their personal punishments. The Romano case had exposed systematic problems in city government that required decades of reform efforts. Vincent Romano Jr. was convicted in 2004 and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He was released in 2016 and worked as a construction laborer, having lost his contractor's license and family business due to his criminal convictions. Frank Romano, Vincent's older brother, received a 12-year federal sentence for money laundering and racketeering. He died in 2011 while still imprisoned, taking many secrets about the Romano operation to his grave. The expanded federal investigation had revealed corruption networks in other major cities. The Romano case became a template for investigating organized crime influence in municipal government, leading to major prosecutions in Chicago, Philadelphia, and Boston. Captain Martinez had retired in 2020, but continued working as a consultant for law enforcement agencies, investigating complex corruption cases. She had written a book about the Romano investigation that became required reading in police academies nationwide. Detective Kozlowski's case demonstrates that persistence and integrity can overcome even the most sophisticated criminal networks. Martinez wrote in her book's conclusion, "His death proved that some principles are worth dying for." The NYPD had implemented comprehensive reforms based on lessons learned from the Romano case. New oversight procedures, ethics training, and corruption reporting systems helped prevent similar schemes from developing. Police Commissioner Edward Caban spoke about the Romano case's continuing influence during a recent ceremony honoring Detective Kozlowski. "This case reminds every officer that we must remain vigilant against corruption and always remember that we serve the public, not ourselves." The construction industry had also been transformed by the scandal. New bidding procedures, oversight requirements, and background checks for contractors had largely eliminated the type of systematic corruption that Romano had exploited. Mayor Eric Adams, speaking at the 20th anniversary of the Romano convictions, emphasized the case's broader significance. Detective Kozlowski's sacrifice led to reforms that have saved taxpayers billions of dollars and restored trust in city government. The farm where Kozlowski's body was discovered had been purchased by the state and converted into a memorial park. Robert Chen, the farmer who found the barrel, had donated the property to honor Kozlowski's memory and educate visitors about the importance of honest government. A visitor center at the memorial park displayed exhibits about the Romano case and its impact on government reform. School groups and police recruits regularly visited to learn about the consequences of corruption and the importance of integrity. Dr. Patricia Valdez, the medical examiner who confirmed Kozlowski's identity, had retired but remained involved in training forensic investigators. The Romano case shows how scientific evidence can solve even the oldest crimes and bring justice to victims' families. The FBI task force that investigated the expanded Romano network had become a permanent unit focused on public corruption. Agent Patricia Hendricks, now the unit's director, credited Kozlowski's case with providing the foundation for modern corruption investigations. Detective Kozlowski's murder investigation gave us the tools and methods we use to combat public corruption today. His death continues to protect taxpayers and honest government employees. Academic researchers had studied the Romano case extensively, using it to understand how corruption networks develop and how they can be detected and dismantled. Universities offered courses specifically focused on the case and its implications for public administration. Professor James Sullivan at John Jay College of Criminal Justice taught a course called The Romano Case: Corruption, Murder, and Reform. His students included future police officers, prosecutors, and government administrators. Detective Kozlowski's case is the perfect example of how one person's integrity can expose massive corruption, Professor Sullivan explained. It shows students that individual actions matter, even when facing powerful criminal organizations. The case had international impact as well. Law enforcement agencies in other countries studied the Romano investigation to improve their own anti-corruption efforts. The methods developed by Martinez and her team were used in major corruption cases worldwide. On August 15, 2025, Elena Vasquez stood before Detective Kozlowski's memorial plaque during the annual ceremony honoring his memory. Surrounded by current and retired police officers, city officials, and community members, she reflected on her husband's lasting impact. 40 years ago, Michael put on his badge and swore to protect and serve the people of New York City. He kept that promise even unto death, and his sacrifice continues to protect people today. Captain Martinez, now 72, spoke to the assembled crowd about the investigation's significance. Detective Kozlowski showed us that integrity is not just about following rules. It's about having the courage to do what's right, even when it's dangerous. The ceremony concluded with the reading of names of all officers killed in the line of duty that year. Detective Kozlowski's name was read last, followed by a moment of silence to honor his memory and all fallen officers. As the ceremony ended, young police officers approached Elena Vasquez to thank her for her husband's sacrifice and to promise that they would uphold the same standards of integrity that had cost him his life. Detective Michael Kozlowski's badge number 4789 remained retired, but his legacy lived on in every honest police officer, every reformed government procedure, and every corrupt official brought to justice through the methods his case had established. The blue barrel that had hidden his body for 17 years was displayed in the NYPD Museum as a reminder of the cost of corruption and the importance of never giving up the search for truth and justice. 23 years after his body was discovered, Detective Michael Kozlowski's sacrifice continued to protect the city he had loved and served, ensuring that his death had meaning far beyond the original crime that took his life.